The forest was quiet that evening, the kind of silence that made the rustling of leaves sound louder than it should. Max, a German shepherd with a coat like burnished copper, paused mid-stride. His ears twitched, his sharp eyes scanning the trees ahead. Something wasn't right. He sniffed the air, catching a faint metallic scent that didn't belong. His instincts, honed by years of loyalty to his human companion, Dr. Ethan Hale, told him to investigate. The fading sunlight bathed the woods in a golden hue, but Max paid no attention to the beauty around him. Instead, he followed the strange scent, his paws making almost no sound on the soft undergrowth. The closer he got, the stronger the smell became, mixed now with something else, a faint, high-pitched hum, almost imperceptible to human ears. It set his nerves on edge. He barked sharply, the sound echoing through the trees. Ethan, sitting on the porch of his cabin with a book in hand, frowned at the sound. Max didn't bark without reason. "What is it, boy?" he called, setting the book aside and rising to his feet. Max's second bark, sharper and more urgent, sent a jolt of concern through him. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and his walking stick, his old injury flaring slightly as he hurried toward the sound. By the time Ethan caught up, Max was standing still, his body rigid with focus. Ahead of him, something shimmered faintly between the trees. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he stepped closer. At first glance, it looked like wreckage, a twisted metal pod, half buried in the dirt, with smoke curling from its seams. But then he saw her. Lying crumpled next to the pod was a figure, small and delicate, with skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Ethan froze, unable to believe what he was seeing. She was humanoid, but unmistakably alien. Her skin shimmered like liquid silver, her hair a cascade of starlight, and her elongated fingers twitched weakly as if trying to grasp something just out of reach. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one a struggle. She was dying. Max barked again, stepping closer to the girl and looking back at Ethan as if urging him to act. Ethan swallowed hard. Everything about this screamed danger. If she was here, others might be, too, others who might not be friendly. But he couldn't just leave her. The scientist in him wanted to examine her, to understand who or what she was. The human in him couldn't turn his back on someone in need. "All right, Max," he muttered, kneeling beside the girl. Up close, her injuries were more apparent. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and dark, viscous blood oozed from a gash along her side. Ethan's hands trembled as he checked for a pulse, unsure if her physiology even worked the same as his. To his relief, he found a faint rhythm under her cool, smooth skin. "We can't leave her here," Ethan murmured, glancing nervously at the sky. He pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her, lifting her gently. She was lighter than he expected, her frame almost fragile. Max trotted ahead, his tail wagging slightly as if reassured that Ethan had made the right decision. The journey back to the cabin was tense. Ethan's mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why was she here? Was she being pursued? But there was no time for answers. For now, he had to focus on keeping her alive. Inside the cabin, Ethan cleared his workbench, pushing aside half-finished projects and old equipment. He laid the girl down carefully, her luminous skin casting faint patterns on the wooden walls. Max settled by her side, his eyes never leaving her, as if standing guard. Ethan rummaged through his supplies, pulling out his medical kit. He wasn't a doctor, but years of living in isolation had taught him enough to handle basic injuries. This, however, was far from basic. Her anatomy was similar enough to guess at what might work, but one wrong move could do more harm than good. He sterilized the gash on her side, noting how her blood shimmered like liquid mercury. Stitching the wound was delicate work, the thread sliding easily through her strange, pliant skin. As he worked, Ethan talked more to himself than her. "I don't know if you can hear me, but you've got to hang in there. Whoever or whatever you are, you've got someone looking out for you now." Max whined softly, nudging Ethan's arm. "I know, buddy," Ethan said, pausing to scratch behind the dog's ears. "We're doing our best." The hours dragged on as Ethan tended to her injuries. When he finally stepped back, exhaustion weighed on him, but her breathing had steadied. She was still alive. That was something. Later that night, as the cabin fell into a quiet stillness, Ethan sat by her side, studying her face. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way, her features delicate and almost ethereal. He wondered what kind of world she came from, what kind of life she had lived before ending up here, broken and alone. Max curled up at her feet, his steady presence a comfort. Ethan reached down to pat him. "Good job today, Max. You found her. Saved her. Now we just have to figure out what happens next." As if in response, the girl stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her eyes were like pools of liquid gold, unfocused at first, but gradually sharpening as they locked onto Ethan's face. She flinched, a soft, musical sound escaping her lips, a mix of fear and confusion. "Hey, it's okay," Ethan said gently, holding up his hands. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." Max wagged his tail and inched closer, resting his head on her leg. The girl's gaze shifted to the dog, her expression softening. She reached out weakly, her fingers brushing Max's fur. He let out a soft woof, his tail thumping against the floor. For a moment, they just stared at each other, man, alien, and dog, bridging a gap between worlds. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, a strange mix of awe and protectiveness. Whoever she was, whatever had brought her here, she was in their care now, and he wasn't about to let her down. Outside, the forest was still again, but the faint hum of something distant, something searching, lingered in the air. Ethan didn't notice it yet, but Max's ears twitched, his body tensing slightly. Trouble was coming, and this was just the beginning. The twilight settled over the forest, casting long shadows between the trees as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Max, a loyal German shepherd with a nose for trouble, stopped mid-step, his ears pricked and his body tense. Something was off. The evening walks he shared with Ethan were usually calm, but tonight the air carried something strange. A faint hum, barely audible, seemed to pulse from deeper within the woods. Max sniffed, catching a metallic tang that didn't belong. His bark broke the quiet, sharp and urgent. Ethan Hale looked up from the porch, a mug of tea warming his hands. At 62, with a graying beard and a limp that still nagged at him from an old accident, Ethan wasn't as spry as he used to be, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He frowned at Max's barking. The dog never raised the alarm without reason. "What's the matter, boy?" he called, setting his mug aside. Max barked again, this time more insistent, and darted toward the tree line. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and cane, his heart thudding as he followed Max into the forest. The dog weaved through the underbrush, pausing occasionally to look back and ensure Ethan was close behind. The further they ventured, the stronger the strange hum became, a sound that seemed to vibrate just beneath the skin. Then Ethan saw it, a faint glow, pale and otherworldly, emanating from behind a cluster of trees. Max stopped suddenly, his body rigid as he stared ahead. Ethan stepped closer, his breath hitching when he saw what lay before them. A small, sleek pod, metallic and scarred, was half buried in the dirt. Smoke curled from its sides, and the glow pulsed faintly from its shattered surface. Nearby, something moved. Ethan's flashlight beam landed on a figure crumpled against a tree, and his grip tightened instinctively on the cane. It was a girl, or at least something that looked like one. Her skin shimmered faintly, like liquid silver under the moonlight, and her hair flowed in strands of soft, iridescent white. She was humanoid, but unmistakably alien. Her delicate form trembled as shallow breaths rattled from her chest. Blood, if that silvery substance could be called blood, pooled around her side. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and drawn. Ethan stared, torn between fear and fascination. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to turn back, to call someone, anyone who could handle whatever this was. But Max moved first, stepping forward and sniffing at the girl cautiously. He let out a low whine, his dark eyes pleading with Ethan to do something. "Damn it," Ethan muttered under his breath, moving toward the alien girl. He crouched beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out to check for a pulse. Her skin was cool, smooth like polished metal, and beneath it, a faint rhythm throbbed. She was alive, but barely. His gaze swept over her injuries. Her arm bent unnaturally, the gash along her side still oozing that strange, shimmering liquid. He had no idea how her physiology worked, but it was clear she wouldn't last long without help. Ethan glanced at Max, who was watching him intently. "You've got a knack for finding trouble. You know that?" he said, his voice soft despite the tension in his chest. He wrapped his jacket around the girl's fragile form and carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, almost weightless, and her head lolled weakly against his shoulder. Max barked once, as if in approval, and led the way back to the cabin. The trip felt longer than it should have, each step heavy with unease. Ethan's mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why was she here? Was she running from something or someone? But he pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on keeping his footing and getting her to safety. Back at the cabin, Ethan cleared his workbench, shoving tools and papers aside to make room. He laid the girl down gently, her luminous skin casting faint patterns on the walls. Max sat by her side, his gaze never wavering. Ethan moved quickly, gathering his medical kit and the few supplies he thought might help. He wasn't a doctor, but he'd patched himself up enough times over the years to know the basics. "Let's hope your anatomy isn't too different from ours," he muttered, inspecting the gash along her side. The silvery blood had an odd consistency, thicker than human blood, and it didn't clot the same way. He cleaned the wound carefully, his hand steady despite the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Stitching the wound was a delicate process, the thread sliding easily through her strange, pliant skin. As he worked, the girl stirred, a faint, musical sound escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises like molten gold. She blinked slowly, her gaze unfocused and filled with pain. Ethan froze, unsure of what to say or do. "Hey," he said finally, his voice low and soothing. "It's okay. You're safe. I'm trying to help." She didn't respond, but her gaze shifted to Max, who had inched closer and was now resting his head on the edge of the workbench. The girl's expression softened, and she reached out weakly, her fingers brushing against Max's fur. The dog let out a soft woof, his tail thumping against the floor. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Looks like you've made a friend," he said, his lips quirking into a faint smile. He finished stitching her wound and splinted her broken arm, doing the best he could with the limited tools he had. By the time he stepped back, exhaustion weighed on him, but the girl's breathing had steadied. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The hours passed slowly, the cabin filled with an uneasy quiet. Ethan sat at the table, his eyes flicking between the girl and the door. Every now and then he thought he heard something, a faint hum, like the one in the forest, but distant. He dismissed it as his imagination, but Max's ears twitched, his body tense and alert. "She's going to need more help than I can give," Ethan murmured his thoughts aloud. "And if someone or something is looking for her," he didn't finish the sentence. The idea of being caught in the middle of something far beyond his understanding wasn't a pleasant one. But he couldn't just abandon her either. Max let out a soft bark, as if in agreement. Ethan reached down to scratch behind his ears. "Good boy," he said. "We'll figure this out. Together. For now." All they could do was wait. And hope. The night was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. Max trotted ahead, his paws crunching the brittle leaves beneath him. The woods, usually filled with the subtle symphony of chirping crickets and rustling trees, were eerily quiet tonight. Ethan Hale followed close behind, his flashlight slicing through the gloom. The old scientist had lived on the edge of these woods for years, retreating into isolation after losing his wife. His days were filled with routine, his evenings punctuated by walks with Max. But tonight something was different. The dog's sharp bark shattered the silence, a sound so urgent it sent chills crawling up Ethan's spine. "Max," he called, his voice trembling with unease. The dog barked again, insistent, pulling Ethan deeper into the forest. The air felt heavy, charged with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Then he saw it. A faint, bluish glow pulsed through the trees ahead, illuminating the forest floor in an otherworldly light. Ethan's breath caught as he stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The source of the light was a sleek, metallic pod, half buried in the earth. Its surface was scorched and scarred, wisps of smoke curling from jagged cracks along its frame. Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. An aircraft? Some kind of experimental technology? Before he could process further, his flashlight beam landed on a figure slumped against the base of a nearby tree. She was small and fragile-looking, her form humanoid but undeniably alien. Her skin shimmered faintly, like liquid metal under the glow of the pod. Long, ethereal hair spilled over her shoulders, and her eyes, closed tightly, were framed by delicate features that seemed too perfect to be real. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and Ethan's heart clenched at the sight of dark, viscous liquid pooling beneath her. Max was already at her side, his body low to the ground as he sniffed cautiously. The dog let out a low whine, looking back at Ethan as if to say, "Do something." Ethan hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the overwhelming need to help. His hands shook as he approached, crouching beside her. Up close, she seemed impossibly delicate, her silvery blood glinting in the pale light. "You're hurt," Ethan murmured, more to himself than her. He didn't know if she could hear him or even understand him, but the words tumbled out anyway. Carefully, he checked for a pulse, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth skin of her wrist. There was a faint, rhythmic thrum, different from a human pulse, but there nonetheless. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. She wouldn't survive without help. Ethan made his decision quickly, shrugging off his jacket and wrapping it around her fragile frame. As he lifted her into his arms, she let out a soft, musical sound, barely audible, but enough to send a shiver through him. Max barked once, wagging his tail as if approving the choice, and led the way back toward the cabin. Inside the small, cluttered space Ethan called home, he laid the girl on his workbench. The warm light of the cabin contrasted starkly with the cold, alien glow of her presence. Ethan worked methodically, his mind switching into problem-solving mode. He cleaned her wounds with care, noting how her shimmering blood clotted differently from anything he'd seen before. He stitched the gash along her side, his hand steady despite the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. As the hours passed, Ethan found himself speaking aloud, his voice filling the otherwise silent room. "I don't know where you came from or how you ended up here," he said, his tone soft but edged with curiosity. "But you're safe now. We'll figure this out." Max sat faithfully by the girl's side, his dark eyes watching every move Ethan made. Occasionally, the dog would nuzzle her hand or rest his head on the edge of the table, as if offering comfort. Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of gratitude for his companion. It was Max who had found her, who had alerted him. Without the dog, she might have been left to die alone in the woods. By dawn, the girl's breathing had steadied, and her silvery skin seemed to glow faintly in the warm light of the rising sun. Ethan sat slumped in a chair, exhaustion tugging at him, but unable to take his eyes off her. When her eyelids finally fluttered open, revealing irises like molten gold, Ethan felt a jolt of both relief and apprehension. She looked at him, her gaze piercing and filled with something he couldn't quite name. Fear, confusion, gratitude? Her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice a soft, melodic hum that resonated in the air. Ethan didn't understand the words, but the emotion behind them was clear. She was thanking him. "It's okay," he said gently, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe here." Max, ever the diplomat, wagged his tail and nudged her hand with his nose. She smiled faintly, her fingers curling weakly in the dog's fur. The simple gesture, so human yet so alien, filled Ethan with an odd sense of hope. Whoever she was, whatever her story, she was here now, and somehow he felt responsible for her. But the peace didn't last long. As the morning stretched on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Max, too, seemed uneasy, his ears twitching and his body tense. The faint hum from the woods, the one Ethan had dismissed the night before, grew louder. It wasn't his imagination. Something or someone was out there. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. If she had crash-landed here, others might be looking for her. And if they found her, if they found him, Ethan didn't want to think about what might happen. He moved quickly, securing the cabin as best he could. The doors were locked, the windows shuttered, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough if they were dealing with technology far beyond his understanding. The girl, now sitting upright with Max pressed protectively against her side, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She spoke again, her melodic voice rising and falling in a way that sounded almost like a song. Ethan frowned, trying to decipher her meaning. She pointed toward the woods, her golden eyes wide with urgency. "You're trying to warn me?" Ethan guessed, his stomach twisting. "They're coming, aren't they?" She nodded, the motion slow but deliberate. Ethan's mind raced. He wasn't a fighter, and the idea of facing off against beings who could traverse the stars was laughable. But he couldn't abandon her. He couldn't let her fall back into whatever danger she'd escaped from. As the hum grew louder, Ethan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let her face it alone. Max barked sharply, his body coiled like a spring, ready to defend his human and their mysterious guest. The tension in the air was palpable as Ethan braced himself, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Man, dog, and alien girl. And in that moment, despite the fear and uncertainty, Ethan felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose.